All right, Alexander, let's do an update on what's going on in Ukraine. And you may want to do an update as to what's going on the ground. I think there's a lot of interesting news with regards to Lysychansk, another try at Snake Island, which is kind of interesting that they keep on going back to Snake Island. I think Lysychansk and Snake Island, to me, maybe there's some more topics on the ground. Kharkiv, but those two areas are to me the most interesting. I don't know what you think or what our viewers think, but there's what's going on the ground, and then I believe that there's some interesting different narratives coming out of the Biden White House, the Collective West. We have a CNN article, we have a New York Times article, we have some parts of the U.S. government debating how to frame the eventual surrender of Zelensky, just to kind of paraphrase there.
Yeah.
And then there's other articles saying that we're in it to the long haul, and the CIA is involved, and it's just 20 countries and all kinds of cells all over Europe. I mean, it's all over the place. Anyway,
Absolutely.
and
Let's
whatever
just
else,
talk.
whatever else we
let's-
think of along the
Exactly.
way as well.
Let's talk about them. Let's talk first of all about the military situation. Now, I mean, you're quite right. The two major flashpoints are northern Donbass, Lugansk region, and also Snake Island. Now, let's just talk first about the one that perhaps ultimately is the really important one, in my opinion, which is northern Donbass, Lugansk region. Now, before, in our last programs, we were talking about the imminent fall of Severodonetsk, and Severodonetsk has now fallen. The Russians are entirely in control now of the entire territory east of the Seversky Donets River, including Severodonetsk. And that was a major Ukrainian defeat. I've been seeing some absolutely bizarre rationalizations of what happened. There's even a British analyst going around that saying this is good news for Ukraine because they've shortened their supply lines and all kinds of things of that kind. But it was a major defeat. They tried to cling on to Severodonetsk. They even launched what they called a counteroffensive there. They were completely defeated and they seem to have suffered very heavy losses. Now, over the last couple of hours, and we're talking about the hours and days since Severodonetsk fell, and Severodonetsk finally fell on Friday. What we're hearing is that there's been a major Russian push towards Lysychansk, and there's even some reports, and it's all very scattered and very confusing, but it seems fairly confirmed that there are now Russian troops and troops from the militia of the Lugansk People's Republic fighting in Lysychansk itself. In other words, it looks like, we have to be careful here because, we're not on the ground, but it looks like resistance in Lysychansk is crumbling as well. Ukrainian resistance in Lysychansk is crumbling fast, and we've seen various theories about how the Ukrainian troops can be pulled out of Lysychansk, and it seems some of them are trying to get out, but the Russians dominate the roads, all the roads out of Lysychansk. They've got their artillery, they've got their helicopter gunships flying around, and it seems that those Ukrainian troops that are trying to pull out, are suffering very heavy losses. It seems to me that this is all part of one battle. The battle for Severodonetsk has just now evolved into the battle for Lysychansk. It's clear that the Russians in this part of Ukraine are on a roll, and they're going to wrap up Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, the Lugansk region very quickly. And there's also some other military movements in other parts of northern Donbass, near ETHEREUM and wherever, which suggests that pretty quickly after Lysychansk falls, we're going to see the push towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which, as you said previously, is going to be game over, certainly in terms of the Donbass, if those two cities fall, which I predict they will. So the tempo of events, at least at the moment, seems to be accelerating, and Lysychansk seems to be about to fall. So that's the situation in Donbass, which, as I said, is the critical battlefield. There's other things going on in other places in eastern Ukraine, around Kharkiv. The Ukrainians launched that counteroffensive a few weeks ago. They've now been pushed all the way back to Kharkiv. The Russians are once more at the gates of Kharkiv. I don't think anybody seriously imagines that the Russians are going to attack Kharkiv anytime soon. But anyway, they're back there, ready to move when the order is given. And of course, the Russians have been launching missiles all over Ukraine, Kiev, Kremenchuk, all these different places. All those reports we're hearing all the time about how Russia is about to run out of missiles, cruise missiles. That never seems to happen. We still see this constant bombardment by the Russians, missiles all over Ukraine. And on my own channel, I did a program a couple of days ago in which there was this article by RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, in which they pointed out the British, this is the big British think tank, that the Russians have launched, I think it was 4 times more cruise missiles over 4 months than the United States produces in a year. So the Russians seem to have a almost unending production line of these things, which they're able to launch up and down Ukraine. Now, the other big story, as you rightly said, is Snake Island. Now, Snake Island is this tiny island located some distance off the coast of Odessa. And also, by the way, it's actually closer, as I understand it, to Romania than it is to Ukraine. But anyway, it's this small place. The Russians captured it right at the start of the war. They've been holding it ever since. And ever since May, the Ukrainians have been trying to recapture it. And it has a kind of obsessive quality. So we see repeated Ukrainian missile strikes at Snake Island. The Russians have built up their air defenses there. It doesn't seem so far as if any of these missile strikes are achieving anything. But given that this is a very small place and fairly isolated, it does seem to be absorbing a disproportionate amount of Ukrainian effort. Now, others who are better strategic thinkers than me can perhaps explain why this place is so important, because I don't see it. I've seen various explanations as to why it's so important. I certainly don't think it's the gateway to Odessa. I think if there's going to be an attack on Odessa, it's going to come by land, and certainly it's not going to break any Russian blockade of Odessa. But at any rate, Zelensky himself seems to be obsessed with it. And there's some rumors that the Ukrainian high command have been arguing against this focus on Snake Island, but Zelensky is obsessed with it. And interestingly, so is the US. A lot of these Western weapon systems that we've been hearing about, the M777, 155mm howitzers, some of the HIMARS systems, Harpoon missiles, all of these seem to be going to this place, all being used to attack Snake Island without any real success so far. But that's the 2 hotspots in the war.
And the articles, Alexander? With,
right, well, let's get on to
different
those.
articles that are now being
Let's
put
get
out
on
there?
to those. Let's get on to those, because it's clear now that there's a massive argument going on within the intestines, if you like, of the deep state, and it's floated upward to the White House itself. There's obviously people taking sides there, and there's also rival briefings by different people. So there's those, as you absolutely rightly say, who say we must stand by Ukraine to the very end, even if this goes on for years and years, and that there's still the good chance that Ukraine will be able to launch this great counter-offensive in the summer and regain all its territory and basically dictate terms to Russia, which will be comprehensively defeated. that's one group of people, the neocon, neoliberal, Victoria Nuland, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken faction. And then there are others who are clearly starting to become increasingly concerned and realistic. So we've now had an article from CNN, which comes after an earlier flurry of articles a few weeks ago. You remember there was an article in the New York Times about an editorial in the New York Times about Ukraine needing to be realistic and consider territorial concessions. Now we have an article in CNN, which is clearly very closely sourced to the US, to the administration. There's clearly been some briefing going on. And they're saying that they're becoming increasingly pessimistic that Ukraine will be able to recapture all its territory, and Ukraine needs to come to some kind of settlement with Russia, and that may mean that it will have to make territorial concessions. So that's CNN. And then we get the other side. We get the New York Times talking about, how there's all this vast intelligence footprint operating in Ukraine itself, all kinds of people there. And that clearly is coming from the people who still advocate fighting, going on fighting till victory. And I don't think this administration has any ability to make a decision. So they don't really seem to know quite which way to turn. On the one hand, you get the sense that the Pentagon, some people in the economics departments, the Treasury, the Fed probably, are becoming increasingly worried about this. I was reading an article by Scott Ritter in which he was going through all of these weapon systems that Ukraine is now demanding in order to launch a successful counteroffensive. And he's pointed out that, the amount of weapons that Ukraine is asking for would exceed the combined armories of, I think I got it right, Britain, Germany, and France. So, it's just not possible to supply the Ukrainians with all that they want. But clearly, there's some people who think that more should be provided. The Pentagon, by contrast, is clearly becoming increasingly nervous. Now, Larry Johnson did a good a breakdown of this New York Times article about the fact that there's all these intelligence people working in Ukraine. And he did point out that one paragraph admits that all the best soldiers in the Ukrainian army have been either killed or wounded or captured. So that Ukraine has, even in this article, there's this admission that it's run out of its best men. But instead of drawing the conclusion from that, you have, CIA people running things in Kiev. You've got special forces from all sorts of NATO countries operating in Ukraine. And from that side, the commitment to continue the war until some kind of victory, however that's defined, that continues. So a divided government and a president who I think can't ultimately make up his mind, but I think who always ultimately leans towards the hardliners.
Yeah, I've been hearing reports, going back to what Larry Johnson pointed out. I've also been hearing reports that Ukraine is actually sending more men to the front lines in Donbass. They do have brigades that are still functioning and operating in the West, and they're actually now starting to bring those men over to the Donbass to double, triple down on failure. I just don't quite understand the strategy, but those are the reports that I'm seeing, and they've been confirmed across a variety of sources. But this goes along the lines of what we were talking about with our live with Robert Barnes, where Robert was kind of dissecting the three components of the U.S. government that are trying to run the Ukraine operation. The Treasury, the Pentagon, and the State Department. And my sense on what's going on is that the State Department is going to win out, even though we were kind of leaning towards the Treasury, because at the end of the day, it's the economy, stupid, and that's what's going to lead to the U.S. removing itself from this conflict. But I just think that inertia has taken over, and we're not going to see the U.S. pull out of this conflict with Ukraine or any country until they suffer a very, very big electoral political defeat, like something big, like the midterms is what comes to mind for me. I mean, like a really big defeat is going to be the only thing, a domestic defeat as well, not a defeat in Ukraine. I don't think they care about that. Thousands and thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are dying in Donbass. Just send in more, Zelensky. Send in more and more. We don't care. But something domestic in Germany, in the UK, in the US, that's the only thing that's going to get these countries to pull back. Because I just think that momentum is in control now. And, in the White House, you talk about the State Department, the Treasury, the Pentagon. You have an empty executive. It's an executive that's a no-show. So, there's no way to go about this than to look at this conflict extending till November, at least from the U.S. side of things. Maybe the UK will be sooner. I don't know what Boris's timeline is.
I think the same inertia applies in Britain as well, actually. And I think that's an important point to make. But, let's not, Britain will discuss some other day. Let's focus on the US, because I'm afraid I agree. I mean, the important thing always to understand about bureaucratic battles in Washington is that, except briefly and to a very limited extent under Trump, but even to a great extent under Trump, the neocons always win them. The neocons always win every bureaucratic battle. And, if it's a case of Iraq, if it's a case of Afghanistan, if it's a case of somewhere or other, Syria, wherever, they always manage to get the United States committed, and they always manage to keep it committed until the position comes when either the thing collapses because of its own weight, which is what happened ultimately, I think, in Afghanistan. They always bear in mind my own personal view that I think that the pullout in Afghanistan was partly intended to get American troops, American soldiers, out of a line of possible Russian retaliation, whilst the neocons focused on Ukraine. So I think that there may have been that aspect of that whole pullout. But fundamentally, they were able to keep the war in Afghanistan going for 20 years. 20 years. They've never really stopped in Iraq, even though none of their objectives were achieved there. They've never stopped, of course, in Syria, though none of their objectives have been achieved there either. And whenever somebody comes along, some realist or other, some, president, Trump wanted to pull the troops out of Syria, for example, they always have this skill of mobilizing parts of the media, mobilizing parts of the bureaucracy, and they're able to block any line of retreat within Washington. So the result is that the United States remains committed, even as the thing itself starts to fall apart. And that's what we're seeing in Ukraine, actually. I mean, the situation in Ukraine is going hideously wrong. There was a fascinating article by a top Ukrainian official, I think his name was Daniluk, who was saying, that the situation is really bad in Ukraine. They're losing men, they're losing equipment, the economy is falling apart. And this is somebody pretty close, high up in the Ukrainian government. And nonetheless, they're able, the neocons always press, keep Ukraine on life support, keep the war going. And you spoke about this utterly irrational policy of, instead of building up your forces in the rear, which is what some people thought the Ukrainians were going to do, feeding them instead into the meat grinder in Donbass. And I think that reflects neocon thinking, because the neocons don't want a narrative to start taking hold of Ukraine losing lots of territory and carrying out retreats, however sensible, however rational that is, because of course that undermines their case for keeping the war going. And they're always ultimately more focused on Washington than on the situation on the ground in any one of the countries that we're talking about. They're always ultimately, their ultimate concern is to retain power in the center, in Washington, whatever happens in any one of the adventures that they launch around the world. And they're very good at this. And I think this explains this very strange Ukrainian strategy, which I don't myself fully understand the military logic of it, but it makes complete logic from the point of view of the neocons' bureaucratic needs in Washington. And it's quite clear to me that Zelensky and his people in Kiev do exactly what the neocons in Washington tell them. So this explains, as I said, the whole dynamic of this, probably explains this weird obsession with Snake Island. And it also explains this constant movement of men and material to the battle lines, instead of keeping them, holding them back, training them up, building up a strategic reserve, and then perhaps either holding the line or carrying out counteroffensives, all these things that we've been hearing about. That would be a rational strategy. I don't think it would work for all kinds of reasons, but it would be a rational strategy. But it doesn't fit in with the political needs of the neocons. And that's why, as I said, we see Ukraine following it, and we see that as the neocons are able to win all these bureaucratic battles, they're able to keep the war going.
Yeah, and I think that Jake Sullivan said something along those lines during an interview that he gave to CNN, where he even said that we have got to continue to feed weapons into Ukraine because our ultimate goal is to inflict as much damage on Russia as we can, so that Zelensky can somehow have some sort of leverage during an eventual negotiation. And of course, the timeline for all of this has now been set to winter. That's like the timeline for all of this to magically occur. But that seems to be the only plan, if you can even call it a plan, that these neocons and neoliberals, because Sullivan is from the Clinton school of thought. So that's what they're going on. This is the plan. Continue the war, escalate, weapons, troops, throw them in the east, and hopefully, I guess, Zelensky gets some sort of big win. Maybe that explains a little bit Snake Island. Maybe that's some sort of PR media win. Zelensky gets some sort of win to get leverage, and then he negotiates and the war's over by winter. Is that their thinking?
I think you've got it, and I think that's what the Snake Island business is all about. I mean, as I said, a disproportionate effort to capture a piece of territory that's less than a kilometre square, apparently. I mean, it's very small. I mean, I may be exaggerating, but it's very small. And as I said, to me, seems to have no strategic importance in order to achieve some win somewhere. And I think you've summed it up exactly. What Jake Sullivan is talking about is not a plan. It's not a strategy. It's holding out until something turns up. I mean, that's basically what it's all about now, which is what the neocons do. Either Russia collapses, or China turns against Russia, or we win India over, or there's some, or Putin dies of cancer, or something of this kind. I mean, this is, or Ukraine is able to snatch some big win on the battlefield somewhere. But this is ultimately what it's all about. And what you spoke about, what Sullivan said, if you really think about it, it's not a plan about, keep fighting in order to improve your negotiating position in, the bargaining table. It's not a plan. It's a rationalization for keeping the war going. I mean, because straightforwardly, with every day that passes, Ukraine loses men, it loses equipment, it loses territory, its economy is going to pieces. As this man Daniluk said, I mean, he actually said that things are just about holding together at the moment, but that's only because, we're in the warm months, in the winter. And I think that's another reason, by the way, that why they wanted, we want something some kind of breakthrough by the winter, because apparently when winter hits, it's going to be very difficult in Ukraine. And I suspect the other thing that may be dictating this timetable of trying to pull something together before the winter is exactly what you said before, the November midterms. Because if the Republicans sweep the midterms, they will, well, I mean, the Republican Party, as we know, is hardly a unified force. But one gets the sense that skepticism, especially amongst House Republicans, who are closer to the grassroots and are more influenced by Trump, skepticism and opposition to the war amongst them is growing. So, there may also be a feeling that if the midterms go, as everybody expects them, that also is providing a potential moment when you can't really sustain this at the current level. I would point out, though, even if the Republicans win a clean sweep in the midterms, that's in November, the new Congress doesn't actually form until late January. So you still have, the remainder of November, December, and much of January, about a 3-month period in which, all kinds of mischief could be done.
Yeah, but that feeds into my final question. It seems like Russia isn't pressed for time. Outside of the false flags that pop up and the media narratives that grab on to those types of false flags that we do get, it seems, 1 or 2 times a month, and the media runs with it. Outside of that, I can't really think of anything else that Russia is at risk for by keeping the war going according to their pace or their timeline. I mean, economic sanctions, it's all been done. So there's nothing really for them to speed up to rush towards.
Well, exactly.
They can take their time. Outside of the false flags, and even there, I just want to say a quick parenthesis, even with the false flags in Ukraine, I think the narrative in the U.S. is so focused on domestic issues, for example, Roe v. Wade or the gun issue, that even the false flags, to me, it's my sense that they're not gaining the mass appeal traction that they would have gotten, say, 6 months ago.
I completely agree, because I mean, I completely agree with that. And I'll tell you, the other factor is that this has been overdone. I mean, the Ukrainians have tried to create narratives around all kinds of, events, the Mariupol theater, the maternity hospital. Or, there's been so many of these stories. And I mean, we've now got overload. So now we have the Kremenchuk, department store. And, where there were 1,000 people, supposedly. But it's just not catching attention because they've already overplayed this one. I mean, they would need to do something infinitely more dramatic, which, of course, they might try. But, I mean, even that probably wouldn't succeed. And you're absolutely right about, attention and interest in it. I looked at the New York Times yesterday evening. For my sins, I have to read this newspaper. But anyway, I looked at the New York Times, and the front page was about Roe and Wade, it was about guns, it was about the economic situation, and, it was tucked away in the bottom left-hand corner. There were a few things about Ukraine. And that was the New York Times, which is one of the most, interested, one of the most outward-looking, outward-focused media journals in the United States. It covers Ukraine much more than most others do. So, this is the problem. I mean, keeping the attention, the interest in America especially, is going to be incredibly difficult as the weeks and months ground on. And I don't think it's possible, actually.
Yeah, I agree. All right. The Duran.locals.com, everybody, and the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.